In the neighborhood, you guys know me. My name is Beto Gudino with Christian Podcast, and today is going to be an amazing episode. We're going to talk about a little bit about the benefits of social media fasting. That's like the overall goal, but we're going to have an expert, a sociologist, talking with us about like how distressful digital technologies can be in our lives. So I'm so excited for this conversation we're going to have today. But before we do that, I want to read a paragraph from the author's book. And the book is right here. I have it in my hands as you're looking at it right now. It's called Restless Devices. And like I always say, I do kind of judge a book by its cover. And this one was like, man, I love it. It's like there's a hand that's disappearing. The device itself, it's transparent. So you can see your own hand. And it's almost like behind the device, there's a human. Like you should be able to see your humanity beyond the device itself. So it's so cool. But then it's kind of like disappearing into like ones and zeros, or kind of like the digital world. So it's so good. So I want to read this excerpt that I think I'm going to try a new thing here on the show. So we'll see how it goes. If you guys are ready, set your minds on this, okay? I want you to be a little zen right now. Okay, let's breathe in. Breathe out. And the point is that as I read this, it's even going to bring some sort of dissonance in your mind. Okay? I hope so. Here it is. Page 22. Life is constantly being lived elsewhere, as our bodies are in one place, but our minds and consciousness reside focused on the stuff of our screens. Our collective consciousness is increasingly one in which no matter where we are or what we are doing, we feel the need to catch up. To catch up on our emails, texts, social media feeds, the news of the day. The internet used to be out there in an exotic frontier called cyberspace. Now the internet is very much in the mundane of our kitchen counters and living rooms, lubricating our social lives and infused into our daily rhythms and habits of being that the comparison of real in virtual from the 1990s simply doesn't make sense anymore. Wow. That's so profound right there. Felicia, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, Felicia, I'm so excited to have you. And like I was saying, I was reading a little bit of your book, and I was hoping it would bring a little bit of dissonance to people listening, with the background of like beautiful birds, and it's almost like you're in a rainforest. Mm-hmm. And the reality that social media, it's like a part of our daily lives, daily rhythms. It's in our kitchens. It's sometimes in our fridges. It's everywhere. It's in our hands. It's almost like we can't even detach from it. So there's a lot to that. But Felicia, can you tell us, like, just to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So I am a professor of sociology. I teach at Westmont College, which is a Christian liberal arts school in California. I've been here 9 years, and I do research on the social and cultural effects of digital and media technologies. And so I'm interested in how our digital routines impact how we do relationships and how we do community and how we imagine and even understand our identities. And so, yeah, I have been teaching, but also writing and thinking about this topic for a while.
Wow. Okay, so you're the perfect person to have on our show today because I think you're an expert in the realities of social media and digital technologies. So, as I was saying, I have the book in my hands, and the first thing that I want to do is that I'm doing here on the show lately is that I offer an emoji reaction. So, I have emojis that range from blasphemous to divine, and there's like 3 more in between. And out of those, I feel like, wow, when I read this book, if I was on Facebook and I was pushing one of the emojis, if I had my own emojis, which one would I push? And I have this thing called the Emoji Tumula. So we're going to go to the Emoji Tumula and just offer you a reaction out of these 5 emojis that I have. So are you ready for my reaction to restless devices? Here we go.
Looks good.
Oh, yeah. So, Emoji Tumula. What's going to be our reaction to restless devices? It's a holy emoji. Holy emoji reaction. So, first of all, Felicia, how do you feel about getting the holy emoji reaction to restless devices?
I'm just glad I didn't end up in the red, you know? I was nervous there. You're going to put me in blasphemous. But yeah, I'm glad I'm on that side.
Awesome. That's what people have been concerned lately on my show. Is like, oh, I hope I don't make it to blasphemous. There's been a few. I try to make it fun, and then, we can talk about it anyways. But yes, I feel like when I think of the digital technologies, but also when I think of your approach to what really the work that you do in the book, I'm like, wow, so helpful, because in a sense you offer tools for people to a little bit like disengage from just like the constancy of living our lives in like a digital reality, right? I used to tease people saying that I was the avatar of Beto Gudino, because I feel like when I record an episode, then it's there and it's like, it's not me anymore. It's like my avatar that stays on the internet forever, right? Now I'm doing emoji reactions and whatnot. But so I guess the first question I want to ask you, Felicia, and I'll just make it general. Are souls lost to productivity?
Oh, our souls lost to productivity. You are starting big here.
We just go for it.
Yeah, I think in American society, productivity is king. I mean, it's where we find our identity and our significance, and I think that is one part of why our devices and our digital technologies are as appealing and as attractive as they are, right? Because they promise productivity. They promise the capacity to multitask. They promise the capacity to engage in product 24/7, right? Like you can be doing it while you're waiting online at the checkout, right? You can be productive. And so as to whether our souls are being lost to it, if we think of productivity as, I'll use a kind of old-fashioned word in the Christian tradition, an idol, right? If we think of it as a kind of idol, a something that we find our significance in, right? Ultimately, then I think a lot of us we're drawn to it, right? We're trapped because we're serving the idol of productivity. But it's not giving us a lot back, right? And it's failing a lot of us now, I think. A lot of us are super tired. We're exhausted. We know it's unsustainable, but we don't know what to do. So I think, if your question is about discipleship in the end of the day, like are people of faith really needing to struggle, right, against the idol of productivity. There's nothing wrong with being productive. It's when it's an idol, right? Yeah. That then it becomes destructive.
Wow. That's so good. So I'm a communications guy. I have a degree in communications from a university in Mexico. And so I remember, and this was like 20 years ago when I was going there, even though I graduated 20 years later. It's a long story, but that's for another day. But it's so interesting to just witness how technology and communications have shifted in the last 20 years, right? It's been happening like since the last 100 years, but it's been so rapidly changing as we enter like the new century. So I love how sometimes in the book you talk about like the story of the internet and like the main characters that have participated in it, and even like the predictions as the internet was starting. And then kind of like, okay, looking back 30 years later, or however many years the internet has been around, kind of like, okay, this is where we got it right. This is where we got it wrong. Let's step back a little bit and tell me, like, what have you witnessed? Where can you tell us, like, I think this is where we're not so bad. I think this is where we're really bad. And just in a broad perspective, like, what have you witnessed in terms of the progress of the internet?
Yeah. So back in the day, when the internet was kind of hit the mainstream, I think there was a lot of hope that it would connect us to each other, right? Enable us to be in touch with people who are geographically far, that it would empower people who usually don't have much of a platform, right? And are often marginalized in society, and that it would free us from our bodies, right? And all the limitations of our bodies. And in a lot of ways, I think those predictions came true, right? Like we can communicate instantaneously with people on the other side of the world. There are so many voices now that can, in theory, be heard on the internet, though we have to, all those voices are having to, try to cut through a lot of noise, right? Wow. And in many ways, we can do so much more when we're not dragging our bodies around with us, right? But at the same time, with all of that said, I think I think the early predictions was that when we got all those three things, like everything would be better. Like people would understand each other, we would live harmoniously, all the authoritarian powers would be toppled, right? Democracy would reign. And, we look around today, and like everyone would be happy, right? We look around today and we're like, wow, geopolitically, it's a total disaster around the world. Interpersonally, right? A lot of people actually feel incredibly lonely, right? Even though we have these connections with people online. And even the marginalized voices, right? Even though there are ways to gain voice and gain platform, it's still incredibly challenging when you're up against other institutions that have a lot more resources in a lot of different ways. And so I think there is definitely benefits. There's no way around that, right? To our new digital lives. But the costs that we experience and the costs that so many of us, I think, increasingly feel are very real also.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's so good. So some of the, like what, like I can picture when the iPhone was starting and, people started having like a computer in your hands versus, a phone where you would call people and maybe text people. That was, what it used to be for. To now you have like an entire computer in your hands. And then I remember like the very first images that we were getting from around the world was, people staring at the screen on the streets, like all the time, right? You're waiting for a bus and you're looking at the screen. You're walking in the street, you're looking at the screen, like everywhere looking at the screen. And I guess back in the days, there was this sense of, are we becoming like zombies, right? Like people who are not paying attention to the surroundings, like so focused, like you're there, but your mind is somewhere else, like we were reading at the beginning, and it I don't know, like do you think that's like people are now used to seeing that it doesn't shock us anymore? Do you think there's a little bit of that? Why do you think are some of those things we're giving up?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think in the beginning, we were surprised, and we kind of laughed at people that ran into, street lights or something, or tripped over the curb, right?
Yeah.
But what's so interesting, I think, about human beings is that we adapt, right? And it doesn't mean that we adapt in a healthy way or that adaptation is good. It's just that we kind of normalize, right? We get used to things. And so I think we've kind of gotten used to people just looking at their phones and not being aware or even really present to the people around them. We do that even with our friends, right? Like we let them, like we give them permission to ignore us, right? When there's a notification and we're having a conversation and we're just like, oh, no, go ahead, check your notification, right? Like there's this very interesting way in which we have all come to really privilege what happens on the screen over and above the things that are happening proximate to us, whether it's the people or what's happening on the street. And I think that is something that is, to me, really troubling, in that what's happening on our screens seems to be more important than my family member who's talking to me or my best friend who's trying to have a conversation with me. Our brains are, not only are we kind of adapting to certain social norms, but our brains, right, are being trained in such a way that we kind of compulsively respond to our screens now, right, over and above a human being who is with us, or what's happening around us.
Yeah, so you talk about some of like the psychological traits behind the way these devices functioned on your book, and like for example, you talk about the Skinner box, the iron cage rationality. There's a phrase called networked individualism. You talk about the Jesus phone, that it was one of the first phrases when the iPhone came out. So I want to talk about a little bit of like those psychological elements that are behind like these technologies that are, in a sense, I guess the thing is that they are made to get almost like our full and complete attention, right? Like, can you tell me a little bit, maybe even just like what is the Skinner box example or the test or whatever that was?
Yeah, so the Skinner box is a experiment or research that was done by B.F. Skinner, who is a behavioral psychologist, who is seeing if he could train a rat to engage in certain behaviors. And so the Skinner box involved a rat that had to press a lever to get food, right? And what Skinner discovered was that he could train the rat more effectively when every time when the rat pressed the lever, there wasn't food that came every single time, right? It came intermittently, right? It would sometimes come, it would sometimes not come. And it was that intermittent sort of delivery of the benefit, the positive reinforcement, right, of pressing the lever to get the food. It was that intermittent, infrequent pattern that actually trained the rat more effectively to constantly press the lever, right? And the idea is that, this is kind of depressing, but we're comparing ourselves to rats, right? Human beings are like rats, right?
Great.
Like we can be, right? We can be trained, right? Conditioned to constantly, quote unquote, press a lever. You might think of that as check our social media feeds or, I always gesture to my students, when we take our thumbs and we scroll down, right, to refresh, right? We're constantly trying to refresh the feed to see if there's a new post or we get some new response, right? we do that more when we actually don't get a positive response or don't get any response every single time, right? And that's why we check so constantly, because sometimes we check and nothing's happened, right? And we're like, I gotta check again. 30 seconds later, maybe something's happened. Yes. And so, I mean, I think I'm saying something that we all experience. Like I experience it all the time, right? And so the idea is we get conditioned in such a way that we get to the point where we don't even realize we're doing it. We don't even realize we're checking. We don't even know why we're checking anymore. We just got habituated, right? And the idea is that Silicon Valley, these tech companies, when they built these platforms, these services, they went to this research. They said, hey, human beings work this way. Let's build something that has the same kind of intermittent positive reinforcement so that people will keep coming back, and we can train people, right, to constantly be checking our sites and our services.
Wow. So we are rats. We are like rats. Let's say we are like rats. We behave like rats, basically. Thank you, Skinner. Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot that I want to cover, but I guess another fun phrase that you used in the book was the Jesus, that some people were referring to the iPhone as the Jesus phone, but then also almost like this comparison with maybe as Christians or people of faith or believers, almost like this comparison, like, wow, who is the Lord now, right? Like this device that's getting my attention so much, is it really becoming almost like an idol or my Lord? Can you elaborate a little bit about what that phrase, the Jesus phone, means to you, or how you approach it?
Yeah, sure. So when the first Apple fans bought the iPhone, I think it was a 4 or 6, they called it the Jesus phone because they're just amazed by it. They're like, wow, it does everything, right? And so it's just a fun name. But I think for people of faith, it's actually really powerful, ironic type of name, because I think it is very similar to one's relationship with Jesus, in that when we do let the device into our life, right? Gradually, it seems to transform us, right? Like nobody's forcing us to check our email, check our text messages. No one's coercing us to do that, right? But gradually, when I look through the years of my relationship with my phone, it's like I've used it more and more in my life. I've let it enter into more and more parts of my life, right? And it's impacting me, right? It's on my mind, right? I think about what might be happening on social media, what may be happening in my messages as the notification goes off, right? Thinking about the emails that I have to write, even when I'm not on the device. And I think for people of faith, in many ways, that's an interesting parallel, right? To the role that our following of Jesus theoretically should take.
Wow, that's so good. And I want to talk in a little bit. I want to talk about almost like you call it the theological anthropology, and maybe we can get a little bit more into like the theological elements of these ideas. But first, there's a phrase that you have on page 19 that I thought, this is so good. It says, most prominently, being connected today is closer to a state of consciousness, a human condition, than a discrete behavior. And is that the metaverse? Is like a state of like collective consciousness somewhere out there in a realm floating in cyberspace?
Well, when I was writing the book, the metaverse wasn't really on the radar yet. I wasn't quite thinking about the metaverse. I think I was more interested in the ways that we tend to think about our relationships with our devices in terms of when we're actually looking at our screens, right? Like when we're actually looking at our phone, or we're looking at our Apple Watch, or whatever it might be, right? But I want to argue that it's not simply the times when we're actually picking up the phone and looking at it that is impacting us. In fact, we are a part of our spirit, a part of our consciousness is actually already dedicated to wondering, to worrying, to planning what we're going to post, right? Or what someone has already said about our post. And it's so deep in such a way that, here's an example. You see a beautiful sunset, right? And automatically, what do we do now? We don't actually look at the sunset and just take it in. What do? We take a picture of it and we post it, right?
And it doesn't look as good.
Never. It never does, right? But it's sort of like we have come to become people who think that to appreciate the sunset, actually to do that is to post it, right? And so that suggests that we're constantly already in that space, even when we're not even looking at our screens.
Wow. And we do it, right? We're all culpable of doing these things. And the thing is there's that desire, like you were saying, of connectivity, of, this is the promise of the digital technologies that we are now. And I'll talk about it in a little bit, when you talk about boredom, but almost like this promise of we can all be in that connectedness. And it's just so interesting, like the good side of it is we do want to share something that's beautiful. We do want to share something we're experiencing that it's meaningful, and that we think, everybody should experience what I'm experiencing because it's meaningful, right? But it's almost like the more you do it and the more it's out there. Like the perfect example, I love going to concerts. It's nobody's enjoying the concert anymore. Everybody's on their cell phone, taking the video of the guy performing. Are you guys there to have a video so that you can watch it later, or just put it down and let the music move you and touch your body and flow through you? But it's so common, right? Every single person is on their phones lifting it up, and wow, there's a lot right there. So I love how you said any sustainable change in the digital landscape will require collective and organizational effort. And then I wrote this phrase. It might be from your book because I didn't put the page, but it says I just read that. Maybe what we need is not so much more knowledge about technology, but more knowledge and understanding about being human. And I think that's where the theological anthropology has a role to play, right? So can you, now that we know, we're all using these technologies, it's in a sense it's damaging our relationships. How does this is it academy or whatever it's theological anthropology, how does that have a role in maybe helping us bring this collectiveness effort or this collective effort to be human again?
Yeah. So I think when we are feeling discontent or exhausted or stressed out by our digital lives, it can often be just very difficult to figure out what's going on, right? Because we're just overwhelmed and we don't know how to make it stop. We don't know what to do with ourselves to get unstuck, right? Because like you said, everyone's doing it, right? And there's no models, right? To what am I supposed to do when I go to that concert and everyone's recording? How do I be the person that just listens? How do you actually do that? And I think some of it, right, or a big part of it is rooted in needing to come to grips with what kind of life we actually want to live, right? And I teach college students, and one of the questions I ask them when I teach this class called Internet and Society, and we're talking about these issues, I say, hey, you guys are young now, lots of opportunities before you. But when you get old, right? When you get old and you're looking back at your life, what do you want to see? Right?
Yeah.
What do you hope that when you look back, what do you hope to see? And I tell them, and I bet you none of you are going to be like, oh, I hope when I look back, I'm going to see this, social media presence where I had all these followers, or I spent all this time, texting, whatever. Like, that's not what all of us are like. When I look back, I want to see my really beautiful relationships with my family, with my friends, meaningful experiences, like adventures around the world, right? Like, those are the things that we all talk about. And that when we answer that question, what do I hope to see when I look back at my days when I'm old, right? That starts to get at the question of, what do we think being human really is, right? And this fancy term, theological anthropology, is just fancy language for saying it's a study of what do we think it means to be human. That's the anthropology part, in relationship to the divine, to God. That's the theological part, right? So when we are taking into consideration, right, the reality of God, what do we think being human actually means, right? And I love that you actually paired the point about the collective and this anthropology, because I think that gets at something very essential, right? That being human is relational, right? But not merely in a, hey, I post one picture, you post one picture, and we hit like, right? Or we send each other a nice emoji, right? Like, we all know that's nice and that's satisfying, but we also know, like, we want more, right? Like, we want more than that, right? And when people have great relationships online, and when they're finally able to be in person together, spend a weekend together, right? It's not always perfect, but usually it's better, right? Right? A lot of times we're like, this is it, and even when it's not great, even when it's hard sometimes in our relationships with each other, and we struggle through them, there's still meaning in there, right? As we work through those struggles together, right? And so I think when it comes to figuring out, well, what do I do with my digital life? How do I change it in such a way that I'm not so stressed out or I'm not exhausted? It has to start with, what do we think being human is? Do we think it's about relationships? Do we think it's about being in our bodies, right? Do we think it has something to do with being in relationship with God, the divine? And if so, if we check yes on all those things, then the next question is, well, what are we going to do about it? Like, how am I going to start living in a way so that when I'm 80 or when I'm 90, I look back, I'm actually like, hey, that was all right. Like, I lived the way that I really hoped that I could.
Wow. I couldn't agree more, because so, for example, this is my own confession, and I love how even in the book you almost like introduce the book by saying that a lot of people come to you to confess because they find out that you work in this realm of social media and the devices and technology and sociology. So, anyways, my confession is, yes, I feel like when, for example, Instagram started, whenever, like 13 years ago or so, or 10, and my goal was like, what a cool place to start posting pictures, and this could be my album of pictures that when I look back, okay, this has been my life. And I think there's still an element of that, but then I thought, as things have progressed and now there's way more apps, way more social media opportunities with all kinds of stuff, right? I was like, okay, the Instagram is not going to be around forever. The people are going to come up with a new invention. People are going to bring like the greatest and latest. And then all these pictures that I'm thinking, this is where I'm going to look. And then at some point, even Instagram said, you know what? You don't own your pictures anymore.
Yeah.
Now we own your pictures. It's like, okay, I can even download my pictures in a good resolution anymore because they're not mine anymore. So I kind of like gave that up and realized there's got to be a more analog way to do these things. So that's my confession. And I want to talk about, you talk about almost like life hacks as like, okay, as humans and we're becoming so, like I was saying, what was the first thing I was saying? That we are losing our souls to productivity, right? So it's almost like this sense of like, oh, whatever life hack that can make me, perform triple and, be better at this or be better at that. I'm going to pursue it, And so you have this, well, I want to talk about the Trinity too, but first, you have a saying from Hannah Arendt, and it's about the launch of the first satellite. And she was saying that it's like a rebellion against human existence as it has been given, a free gift, which he wishes to exchange as it were for something he has made himself. So almost like this idea of life hack of, a satellite is going to make us better. It's going to make us connect. And this was from like 1958 or something, right? When this person wrote this. So way before, like all these internet capabilities and whatnot. But tell me a little bit about these life hacks where it's almost in the sense of like rebellion against human existence as it is.
Yeah. So that quote by Hannah Arendt is so interesting because it gets at the heart of so many of our dissatisfactions as human beings. Like it's a drag that we can only be in one place at one time. Like I always tell my kids that if I could have one superpower, I would have the superpower of bilocation, so I could be at two places at once and be doing things separate, two places.
Yes.
Got to tell Marvel to come up with something like that.
Yes.
But the thing about being a Christian and the theological anthropology is actually coming to a place of accepting our humanity in all of its potential and all of its limitations, right? That is that as human beings, we are created with bodies that were meant to occupy a particular time, a particular place, and there is limitations, right? That we can't do everything and more. We can only do so much. We all have to sleep, right? And we all have to eat to survive and to thrive. And so many of us, I think, have lived into an expectation that, hey, oh man, if I could just sleep less and I could eat less, I could just keep on getting things done, right? That would be a better life, right? But I think the scriptures actually tell us, right? And even in the incarnation of Jesus as a human being, right? It suggests that, no, like it's actually good. It is good to want to eat. It is good to want to sleep. Like these are gifts. Right? Resting and eating, these are gifts of time, gifts of experience. And so instead of resisting it and fighting against it, what would, my book is basically asking, like, what would it be like to actually accept and kind of lean into some of this stuff, right? And lean into the rest that God wants to give us as a gift, lean into the enjoyment of food, right? And often food eaten with friends and family, right? In communion with others. There's something holy about that, that there's so much meaningfulness and fulfillment, right? That doesn't come from productivity, right? In fact, comes from things in our lives that often feel fairly unproductive, but in fact are truly fulfilling because that's how we were created as human beings.
Wow. That's so good. love it. And there's, well, I have so many phrases that I wrote down, but I also want to get to our part where we talk about from blasphemous to divine, which is your opportunity to go through the emoji reactions. So I'm going to choose right now one of the topics that I found like super helpful when you talk about the Trinity and kind of like your understanding of what the Trinity meant. And it was almost like you were saying, I kind of knew what it meant, God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But then you quote Colin Gunton, who says God's very essence consists of being in relationship. Like the Trinity, like that's the essence of what it means to be a triune God, that he is in relationship. And if therefore we are created in his image, well, there's a sense of like our essence should be relationship too, right? So I think to me, like that sum up like the whole theological argument is like, oh, oof, that's solid. So can you tell me a little bit about what it meant for you to discover what the Trinity is in that relationship realm?
Yeah, I grew up in a space where talking about the Trinity was just some sort of like philosophical kind of debate, kind of like, well, how do you get three things in one? And, batting around the philosophical, logical boundaries of that. And when I came to discover that, to think about and to imagine the Trinity as not merely a philosophical problem to solve, but actually this really beautiful picture of relationality, right? Where it would be possible for three beings to actually be one, right? That they are intertwined with each other, that their identities depend on each other, and that they're distinct still, right? I just think the puzzle of how it works in the Trinity is so much the puzzle that we're working through, the challenge of what we're working through in contemporary culture, right? It's just like, how do you let people be distinct, different from each other, and still be in unity, right? I mean, that's the question of the church, right? That's like through the ages. It's just like, how do you let people be of different cultures, be of different ethnicities, be of different political ideologies, and still be unified, right? And the Trinity says, well, this is actually what it's about. You don't require everyone to become homogenous, right? To be the same, to do exactly the same thing. But it's actually needing to let each other be fully who they are in their diversity, right? In their particular identity, right? In Christ, that we can experience actually what being in relationship with God is, right? And so I think to me, it's exciting, right? It's sort of like, wow, it gives me hope, right? That we have a God that understands difference, that actually lives into that and finds more fulfillment, right, out of difference than sameness. That gives me hope.
Wow, so good. Well, thank you for elaborating on that. And yeah, that was one of my favorite. I think it spoke to me personally, like, oh, what a great like vision of how the Trinity works and how it can be reflected in us as humans. And so I have there's a phrase by one of the bands I love named Kings of Leon, and they have this phrase in one of their songs that says, "Take the time to waste the moment." It's almost like a paradox right there, right? Like an oxymoron, like take the time to waste the moment. But in this, I guess this is, before we go to the emojis, what would be one of the main benefits? Like I know, for example, like you talk in the book about like giving up Facebook, right? So is there is there like, if you do this one thing, it's going to be so helpful in this way? Like the main benefit of social media fast, of giving up maybe an app or your notifications, or is there like one thing you would call people or invite them to? If you do this, you're going to experience this thing. Or is there too much?
Well, I do shy away from prescribing a plan, right? Because I do think we are really different. Each of us has really different relationships with technology, and we're drawn to it in different ways, which is why in the book I suggest experiments. Like we got to try different things to figure out what works for us. But I do think one general principle that I think might be helpful is finding a way to start our day without any devices. And what I mean is like 10 minutes, like when I wake up, the first 10 minutes, if I can just spend it not looking at my phone, not looking at my feed, not looking at my text, not looking at my calendar, not looking at, right? There's 10 minutes where I actually feel the slippers that I walk in, smell the coffee that I'm drinking, actually see what is outside the window, right? Take a couple breaths like you started this episode with, right? Just a little bit of grounding, and we all have different things, for some of us, we might, want to stretch. We might want to listen to a song. We might want to play a song if anyone out there is talented, right? But like doing the thing that's 10 minutes that just lets you enter into your body, be present before you let all of it come in on the phone. And for some of us, that might mean having to get an alarm clock. This is what my students always tell me, because they wake up, they touch their phones because it's their alarm clock. And I'm like, well, maybe you need to get an analog alarm clock, like old school, yes, right? So you can put your phone somewhere else and wake up and spend 10 minutes without it.
Yeah. Wow. So good. Okay. So we are going to go from blasphemous to divine based on our emoji reactions. And I'll give you one of them. This is mine. This is my own idea that I was thinking as we were talking. I'm like, okay, I'll give you a freebie with blasphemous. I was thinking, as we were talking about being present, I thought the most blasphemous technology that we could ever invent would be teleportation. As you were talking about, I wish I could be in all kinds of places. I'm like, if one day, for whatever reason, that becomes a reality, I think that's the end of humanity. Like, like we are in big trouble. Teleportation would be like, we lose ourselves. But what would be the most blasphemous idea that you can think of when it comes to social media or the digital age and technology?
This is a question for me?
Yes.
Ooh. I think it would be, you joked about the metaverse. I think the most blasphemous thing, kind of, this is along your lines, is if we could actually like know what other people are actually thinking through our technologies. That would be really bad. Like if we could read each other's minds.
Yes.
That would be a real mind trip that would go very badly.
Wow. Okay. Good. That's blasphemous right there. A skeptical idea, or what are you skeptical of when it comes to the digital age and technology and devices?
I think I would be skeptical about our technology, the tech companies' capacity to know what's good for us. I just think that most of the folks that are making the decisions haven't spent enough time looking at history, thinking about the vulnerabilities that people actually experience in their lives, to be careful. Right, to be careful about the kinds of technologies that they promote.
So good. All right, let's move on to inspired Emoji. Where do you see something that inspires you, or inspiration, or something that you feel like it's inspired in this realm?
My first thought, and this is about church life, my first thought went to there's a movement that I recently learned about where there are churches that are starting up that are about eating together, right? Like when they get together, they don't do like all the standard Sunday worship stuff. Like they get together and they actually eat. Like that is the time to do church together.
Wow.
Not like after service, not down in the basement, like eating together. And that strikes me as getting something very right that I don't know a whole lot about, but I'd love to learn more about.
Wow. Yeah, that's inspiring right there. So good. Okay, something holy when it comes to technology, the digital age, and devices.
Can I say that when we actually set it aside, we might actually experience some holy moments sometimes.
So the abstinence.
Yeah, exactly. And again, not like full on. I mean, it could just be 10 minutes, right? Where it's like we create a little time, we protect that time where we can have our eyes open to a bit of holiness that's like right in front of us, whether it's in a person or something in nature, it's just right there.
Wow. So good. Yeah. I love it, love it, love it, love it. Okay. So the last is divine. What is like the most divine idea when it comes to social media, digital age, technology?
Ooh. I don't know. That one's a hard one, Beto. I think that there are a lot of good intentions that our technologies have been created for. And that's what makes it so tricky. Because, these technologies, social media were created to help us connect. And there's been a lot of good. But at the same time, I think it is in our over-reliance and in the ways that these technologies have been designed to condition us to over-reliance, that we kind of lose an appetite for the divine, actually, which is kind of scary to me. But I think what's exciting, maybe this gets back to inspired, is I think especially young people, even though they're growing up in it, I think they might see more clearly because there's a hunger for the divine that I see in a lot of my students. And when they taste it, they're like, yeah, I want more of this. So that's exciting to me.
Wow. There it is. Wow, my friends, what a ride. What an amazing episode with Felicia. Felicia, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being on the show. Can you point people to, where they can find your book, your work, get to know you a little more maybe? Not on Facebook, of course.
Yeah, so I have a personal website. It is FeliciaWuSong.com. You could also find me as a faculty member at Westmont College. That has the same sort of link. But the book's being sold at all the regular places. You could also find it directly from InterVarsity Press, where it's published.
Love it. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks. It's been great. Thank you.